Waking up this morning, there was some pretty bad news for South Africa. There is a bill that has been proposed by Congressman Ronnie Jackson. He used to be Donald Trump's medical practitioner in the White House. He's now a member of Congress. And he has proposed a bill that is very punitive towards South Africa. And he announced this morning that this bill has gone through the committee stage. We'll find out from Joshua Maservi, who's with the Hudson Institute, what all of this means. Josh, good to be talking with you. This next step in the, I suppose, punishment of the ANC and South Africa generally by Washington, that's the way it's being interpreted in South Africa, appears to have taken quite a big leap forward. I remember last time we were talking about this proposed bill of Congressman Jackson, it was no sure thing that it was actually going to ever come to pass. But it appears as though that's no longer the case.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Alec. This is a big development, of course. I would note what I frequently do, that this type of action is a response to South African actions that have been going on, South African government actions, I should say, and ANC actions that have been going on, stretching back years and years at this point. I understand that it gets framed as punishment sometimes, but again, from Washington's perspective, this really is a response in kind to what has been going on for a long time. This is a big step. It's not the last step by any stretch of the imagination, but indeed, getting it through what's called markup, which is essentially a debate within the relevant committee, and then having a vote on it and having it pass through committee is indeed one of the major hurdles for a bill in our fairly convoluted legislative process. So the next step would be it getting a full House vote. That's no guarantee. It's very difficult to get standalone pieces of legislation such a vote, given the crowded nature of the House's calendar. And particularly Africa legislation is sadly oftentimes not prioritized like some other things are. But if it doesn't indeed receive that full House vote, it will almost certainly pass. This is a Republican-controlled House. Then it would move to the Senate. It would have to go through a similar process on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where there would also be a markup, a discussion, a debate, perhaps some amendments offered. I expect if it did reach that stage, it would also make it through the SFRC, because that's also Republican-controlled. If they amend the bill in some way, then it has to go back to the House. They have to vote on the amendments. Then it would move eventually to a full Senate vote. And then if it indeed passed a full Senate vote, then that also would feature some of the same caveats I gave for a full House vote. It's difficult to get on these congressional calendars, etc. Then it would go to President Trump's desk. He would sign it. It would be law. That's the general process. So it's still a long process, but indeed, getting it out of the House Foreign Affairs Committee through markup is a big step. A lot of bills never even make it to that stage.
So let's just retrace your footsteps a little. Republican-controlled House of Representatives, you said you're confident that it would go through there. Then on to the Senate. The first step on the Senate, it would be, you're confident would go through there as well. And that final step of the whole Senate voting on it, is that you didn't say that you felt that would, it was confident that would go through too. Is there any reason for that?
No, I think it would go through a full Senate. Again, it's also Republican controlled. The real question marks for me are whether they can get it onto the calendar. That's frequently one of the main challenges, actually, and you really need oftentimes leadership support. In this case, Representative Brian Mast is the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. If an interesting signal would be if he became a co-sponsor of this bill, that would be a very strong signal. That he will do whatever he can to get it moving and onto the full House calendar, which is oftentimes necessary to have that type of leadership support. He doesn't necessarily have to be a co-sponsor to still lend that type of support, but obviously it's a public display when he does, if he became a co-sponsor in that way. And then it's a similar dynamic on the Senate side. If you can get Senate leadership or enough co-sponsors from the relevant committee, which in this case would be the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that gives it a little more momentum and more chances to get onto the respective calendars that the bill has to get onto before it can even receive a vote. And in some ways, the vote is almost the easy part in this
Mhm.
specific instance. Again, because Republicans control the House, because Republicans control the Senate, it's likely, it's not guaranteed, but likely that it would receive support, including, by the way, from Democrats. What's interesting, if you look at the voting out of the that just happened out of markup, out of the committee, some Democrats supported it. So this is indeed a bipartisan issue.
Wow. That's a bit concerning. If you were trying to stop it, how would you do that?
Well, if I were the South African government, I would very quickly undertake some substantive reforms and course corrections that Washington, that people like myself and others, and including from within government, have been telling the ANC and the South African government that would help repair the relationship. Thus far, we've seen no such actions from the South African government or from the ANC. They just almost seem to continue to double down, continue to provoke, continue to communicate to the United States that they have no intention of changing any of their problematic behavior, that they are going to continue on. The most obvious and recent example of this is that they've now officially forced the Taiwan representation that was based in Pretoria, out of Pretoria, the political capital, obviously, and that comes on the heels of Paul Mashatile visiting Beijing, and then he came back either with his marching orders or just because he thought that was a way to further ingratiate himself and his government with the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. So those types of things are noted with concern in the United States, and that specific issue of Taiwan actually came up during the debates on the markup. So these things do not go unnoticed, but unfortunately, we've seen nothing. The U.S. government has seen nothing. People who follow these issues closely, like myself and others, have seen nothing that suggests the South African government or the ANC is going to take any of the substantive changes that are necessary to prevent something like this bill or other actions from the United States to proceed.
We're getting a very different story or different message in South Africa. First of all, that the White House meeting was a success. Speaking to you, that doesn't seem to be the case. In the committee, in the debate that you've just referred to that has just happened, what other substantive issues were brought up that if there were a desire by the South Africans to, the South African government to spike this bill, that they could address?
The relationship with Russia was raised, including the joint naval exercises that South Africa has hosted off its coast, joint with Russia and China. Uh, Countries have joint exercises, military exercises all the time with a variety of countries. But in this issue, given the parlous state of South Africa's navy, it's very difficult to see what of substance or benefit the South African Navy is deriving from these exercises. They seem primarily designed to help the Chinese and Russians project power in a sensitive part of the world. So that was raised, and other aspects of the relationship with Russia were raised. the ANC's very tight relationship with the theocratic dictatorship in Iran was raised. Uh, its warm relationship with the terrorist organization Hamas was raised, and more generally, the ICJ case, the South Africa's championing of this ICJ charge of genocide against Israel was also brought up in the debate. So it's all the issues that have exacerbated or been irritants within the relationship, known irritants, I should say, for months and even years in some cases. So, as someone who follows this issue fairly closely, I wasn't surprised by any of the concerns that were raised.
Is anyone batting for South Africa? In other words, is there any lobbying going on behind the scenes that can perhaps dampen the enthusiasm which the lawmakers in Washington seem to have at the moment against this country?
Well, there were a number of Democrats who expressed their opposition to this bill. So the South African government and the ANC has traditionally had a fairly close relationship with the Congressional Black Caucus, which is a caucus, as its title suggests, of African American legislators. Um, so the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Gregory Meeks, Representative Meeks, was expressed his opposition, as did several of the other Democrats on the panel. I think a lot of their opposition was based on misperceptions of what the ANC is today. They sort of harkened back to Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid struggle, which is correct, but the ANC has betrayed that legacy long ago, and for decades now has been one of the chief cheerleaders and diplomatic supporters of some of the world's worst regimes. So the idea that the ANC and the South African government is a champion of human rights, a global voice of conscience, is badly outdated. But those were the narratives that some of the Democrats were channeling during this subcommittee hearing, even as they expressed the fact that they did have their own reservations about how the South African government, I should say, has been behaving. There's also concern around AGOA, which uh, South Africa losing AGOA benefits, which is a concern I share, by the way. I don't think that's the right way to approach this issue for the United States to cut off South Africa from AGOA. Although I will note, South Africa is quite clearly in violation of the parameters of AGOA, or the requirements to remain in good standing in AGOA. Um, so I think the South African government and the ANC has some sympathetic uh, allies in Congress. But I think it's a dwindling group, frankly, and even those allies are not as staunch as they once were. I think some of those allies are motivated by their desire to oppose President Trump and the narratives that he has, or the concerns that he's expressed about South Africa. So I think that's part of the motivation. But really, I think the years of the ANC just receiving the benefit of the doubt in Washington are largely gone. Not entirely, but largely gone.
Let's have a look at that quote now, or tweet that Ronnie Jackson, the representative, put out this morning, and he was very forthright about it. The days of allowing our so-called allies to walk over us are, in capital letters, over. Tell us a bit more about Ronnie Jackson and why he would be leading this charge.
Well, as you referenced in your opening remarks, he was the White House physician for President Trump in President Trump's first term. He's a representative from Texas. He is on the Africa subcommittee on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He has he has a real interest in Africa. He's traveled to the continent a number of times, including to places like DRC and elsewhere, trying to better understand the conflicts and the problems, but also the opportunities there. I'm sure was part of his motivation. So he is quite forward leaning and proactive on some of these African issues. And again, he is on the relevant subcommittee, so it's unsurprising in that sense that he's taken a keen interest in South Africa, as a variety of legislative of congressmen in the U.S. have as well, not. Including those who aren't even on the Africa subcommittee. South Africa is a prominent and important African country. The U.S. has a decades old history with it, one that was at times difficult. So it's a little bit more on the radar of your average congressman than a lot of African countries would be.
Well, it still has the largest GDP in Africa, despite the Nigerians pushing theirs up by 30%. So South Africa still comfortably number one in that position. What is in this bill, though, that is or should be making people in Pretoria at least a little nervous?
Yeah, the bill is similar. It's actually built off of a previous bill by Representative James, who previously was the chair of the Africa Subcommittee in the previous Congress, the Congress that preceded this one. So, in that respect, it's the same. It expresses concerns that the U.S. has about how South Africa has behaved for years. The concerns you and I have already discussed. The difference in Representative Jackson's bill is that it calls for a process that could end in targeted sanctions against ANC officials under the Global Magnitsky Act, which is a legislation that allows the United States, gives the president the authorities to impose sanctions for corruption and human rights abuses. Obviously, the ANC would be highly vulnerable to such sanctions, given the very well documented, including by South African organizations, the very well documented record of corruption, ongoing corruption within that party and by specific ANC officials. So they almost on a prima facie basis meet the criteria for Magnitsky sanctions, and it's something that I've been saying for quite a while now that I think this is the approach the United States should be taking is targeting the specific people who are actually responsible both for the antagonism that we've seen toward the United States, uh, but also the destruction, frankly, within South Africa, the crumbling infrastructure, the extraordinary loss of wealth that has occurred, the spiraling crime rates, all of the domestic problems that we've seen, all of which have happened on the ANC's watch. And so I think going after these specific ANC officials on the basis of their corruption would probably be well received, would be my guess, even within South Africa among ordinary South Africans. And it's certainly within the legal remit that Congress has given President Trump, or
Josh, with
any American president, I should say.
with the position that you hold at the Hudson Institute, and for those who don't know, it's one of the premier think tanks in the United States. You would no doubt have been following the recent developments in our country with Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi dropping bombshells here and saying that there are criminals who are um, manipulating or managing puppet politicians who are sitting in parliament. He said even some members of the cabinet, or perhaps he didn't say that specifically, but it has been reported in subsequent terms. Does clearly this will not be aiding South Africa's case in trying to at least get this bill toned down a little. But are people taking note of these kind of developments?
I think so. Certainly, people like myself who follow these issues closely are. I think in Congress, the reality for Congress is they have massive portfolios. You can think of a congressman, let's say on the Africa subcommittee. Africa would only be one part of his portfolio. He has domestic issues. He has the entire globe. If depending on if he's on other, he or she is on other committees or just happens to have personal interests. So congressmen frequently can't be way down in the weeds on details of such things. Staffers, the people who sort of collect information for them, analyze information and feed it up to them, or respond to requests from the principal, can be a little better versed, but even those also have huge portfolios. So it's hard for them to be way down, as I say, in the details on some of these day to day developments. The professional staffers on the relevant committees are usually real experts. They follow these issues full time. So I am very sure that the professional staff members on both the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who have Africa as part of their or as their portfolio, and their counterparts on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee are tracking these issues with great interest. And as you say, it's yet more evidence of the fact that, well, they're allegations. So I'm not going to say that whether or not they're true, but um, they would be unsurprising. Let's say if they do turn out to be true, there is unfortunately a history in South African politics of capture. We Gupta, the Gupta brothers were not that long ago. It was just under the previous administration where it was proven, it was documented that they had so totally captured essentially the presidency that they could offer ministerial posts for the right price to politicians. So there is a history of this, unfortunately, and again, it does demonstrate that the US's concerns around things like corruption and remain relevant to South Africa.
Just a bit of realpolitik now. What's the upside for the United States in going forward with this bill? And I ask this because it seems like the best hope Pretoria's got right now is that you lose interest, or Washington just loses interest in this topic, moves on to something else. The bill gets forgotten, and life goes on. But what's the upside of actually pushing this through, apart from Ronnie Jackson himself clearly wanting to get it on, or get the headlines for it?
Yeah, for the United States, I think there's a number of things. One, perhaps it will finally persuade the ANC and the South African government to stop the actions that have so badly damaged their relationship and that are a problem for American national interests. This is why I've advocated for targeted sanctions. I genuinely believe the elites, the relevant elites here in South Africa, aren't going to change their mind unless they are personally affected. You could kick them out. You could kick South Africa out of AGOA. You could even put tariffs on. I think that that would be damaging. They would dislike it. But they are so totally committed to, in some cases, some of them are so totally committed to this anti-American approach, to consistently provoking the United States, to consistently trying to aid and succor in real ways American adversaries, that the only way their calculation might change is if you bring personal consequences to them. So that's the hope of a bill like this passing, that it will move the sanctions process along further and maybe give it some more momentum. So that's one reason. Another is I think it would send a message to, because there are other governments, including in Africa, that behave in similar behavior, not as brazen or blatant as South African government does, but they do indeed try to oppose the U.S. where they can. American policymakers' fundamental obligation is to the good of Americans. That's their bottom line. And so, if there's a country out there that is damaging the good of Americans, they are obliged, if they're taking their job seriously and want to do it properly, to try to address that. So if again, there are real consequences for these provocations from the South African government that may well send a it may well be a cautionary tale for other governments that they should tread carefully. If there's been this strange situation for years, including with South Africa, where uh, governments expect that they can be hostile to the United States. I'm thinking, Zimbabwe would be a great example here. They can be hostile rhetorically and in practice, and then still demands and expects hundreds of millions of dollars, for instance, of American aid. That's a very strange and even perverse situation. And I think under the Trump administration, that's changing. But I think there are these African governments that have become used to the status quo, and there needs to be an example that things have indeed changed.
A cautionary tale in one way of saying it, making an example is another way of saying it, and that message doesn't seem to have landed. Certainly not within the ANC and within the union buildings. But Josh, just to close off with, you hosted the three Africana leaders. We call them now the three Africana amigos at one of your events a month or so ago. What was the reaction like amongst those who attended to the message that Corne Mulder and Gerard Papenfuss and Theo Diaga were giving?
I think it was largely positive. Of course, there were critiques that arose, both during the during the session itself and afterwards. Some of the issues that the delegation were discussing have corollaries in the United States, and they're not exactly the same, but some of the principles involved are similar, at least. So that can provoke depending which side of the aisle, the political aisle you're on in the United States, that can provoke a certain reaction. So I think some of the reaction um, that the delegation received was informed a bit by domestic politics here in the United States. But again, I think by and large it was positive, and they had. I've said this previously. I think South Africa, the South African government, South African people actually should be grateful for them, because they were at great pains, both in the session that I hosted with them, and I know in meetings they had with the US government, to really communicate that cutting South Africa off from AGOA would badly hurt ordinary South Africans. They did indeed try to communicate a positive, forward-looking message. Yes, they gave the critiques of the ANC and the South African government that they have, but they were really at pains, as I said, to try to present a positive vision and say, look, this is the way forward. They tried to communicate to Washington that there is a lot of goodwill within or within the South African population, even in segments of the South African government, even within the GNU itself. There's parties like Corne Mulder's party, or the DA or others, that are pro-Western and want to have a strong relationship with the United States. That's an important nuance. Because again, for an American policymaker who doesn't follow these questions really closely, it can be easy to miss the fact that the South African government is not a monolith, that it is made up of disparate elements, some of which are very pro-American. And so that requires a nuanced response from the United States. So I think the delegation, it got very good access, it got very good meetings, and I think it was largely well received.
Well, I hope that those same observers in the United States will realize that the polls and the research here from the Social Research Foundation and others shows that there's an overwhelming, amongst the population, an overwhelming desire to be closer to America and not to make it an enemy. So it's not the South African people that you're dealing with here or having problems with. it's certain South African politicians. Joshua Masovi is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He looks after the Africa portfolio there. And I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.